Somewhere in what's now Iraq, roughly 60,000 years ago, a group of Neanderthals dug a grave. Not a hole to get rid of a body, not a quick disposal to keep predators away from camp. A grave, deliberately shaped, with the body placed in a specific, deliberate position, and around that body, pollen from several distinct species of flowering plants, in concentrations high enough that researchers who excavated the site, a cave called Shanidar, argued it couldn't simply be wind-blown accident. Somebody, tens of thousands of years before writing, before agriculture, before anything you'd recognize as civilization, gathered flowers and placed them with their dead. That single detail raises a question that's genuinely much harder to answer than it sounds. Not whether ancient humans died. Obviously they did. Everyone eventually does. The real question is whether they understood what was happening to them and to the people they loved while it was happening. Did a dying Neanderthal in that cave know, in the way you and I understand it right now, reading this sentence, that they were a finite thing, running out of time, about to stop existing entirely? Or was death, for most of our evolutionary history, something that simply happened to a body, observed by the living, without ever being fully grasped by the one it was actually happening to? This is one of the genuinely hardest questions in all of paleoanthropology, because unlike a stone tool or a fossilized bone, you cannot dig up a belief. You cannot excavate an internal understanding of mortality directly. What researchers actually have to work with is behavior, physical evidence of how ancient humans treated their dead, and from that behavior, they have to carefully, cautiously infer what kind of mind was capable of producing it. Let's go through what that evidence actually shows, because it's more layered, more surprising, and more genuinely moving than most people expect going in. Let's start with the absolute baseline, because it matters as a comparison point. Most animals do not appear to engage in anything resembling deliberate mortality-aware behavior around death. A gazelle doesn't hold a funeral. When an animal dies in the wild, its body is typically left where it falls, scavenged, and that's essentially the end of the story as far as observable behavior goes. There are some genuinely fascinating exceptions worth mentioning briefly. Elephants have been repeatedly observed lingering near the bones of dead herd members, sometimes touching or investigating the remains repeatedly over extended periods, and some primate mothers have been documented carrying the bodies of dead infants for days or even weeks before finally letting go. These behaviors suggest something is happening emotionally, some kind of attachment disruption being processed. But there's an important distinction researchers draw here, and it's worth being precise about it. Grief-adjacent behavior, an emotional response to loss and absence, is not the same thing as a conceptual understanding of death as a universal, permanent, and personally applicable fact. An elephant investigating a skull may be experiencing something real and significant. That doesn't necessarily mean the elephant has formed the abstract idea, I too will someday cease to exist, the way a human capable of genuinely dreading their own future death clearly has. So the real question for ancient humans becomes, when did our ancestors cross from something like that first category, an emotional response to loss and absence, into the second, a genuine abstract understanding that death is universal, permanent, and personally inevitable? And the evidence suggests this happened gradually, in stages, and the stages themselves are genuinely fascinating. The earliest stage researchers can identify with real confidence is what you might call simple corpse disposal, treating a dead body as something to be removed from the living space, likely for practical reasons, hygiene, predator avoidance, without any clear evidence of ritual, ceremony, or symbolic meaning attached. This kind of behavior shows up early and is genuinely hard to distinguish from purely practical animal-level behavior. It tells you very little on its own about internal understanding. The next stage is where things get genuinely interesting, and it's called deliberate burial, and the evidence for this stretches back considerably further than most people assume. At a site called Cima de los Huesos in Spain, researchers have found the remains of at least 28 individuals, dating back an almost unbelievable 430,000 years, deposited at the bottom of a deep vertical shaft that would have required deliberate, repeated effort to access and use, well before anatomically modern humans even existed. This predates Homo sapiens entirely. It was almost certainly the work of an earlier hominin species. Among the remains, researchers found a single, beautifully crafted stone hand axe, made from a rock type not naturally found at the site itself, meaning it had been deliberately carried there and deposited alongside the bodies rather than simply lost or discarded. Researchers have nicknamed it Excalibur, and while its exact meaning is impossible to know with certainty, the deliberate transport of a finely made tool to a site used repeatedly for depositing the dead suggests something considerably more complex than simple practical disposal. It suggests intention. It suggests the site itself, and what was being done there, mattered to the people doing it. Then we get to Shanidar Cave, the Neanderthal burial site we opened with, dating to around 60,000 years ago, and the evidence there pushes the story further still. Beyond the debated flower pollen, which some later researchers have suggested might partially reflect burrowing rodent activity rather than purely deliberate placement, an important caveat any honest account of this evidence has to include. The site also contains multiple Neanderthal burials showing clear evidence of deliberate body positioning, bodies placed in specific, consistent postures rather than simply left where they fell or dumped in a pit. Deliberate positioning of this kind requires a specific kind of forward-looking, symbolic thought. You don't carefully arrange a body a certain way for purely practical reasons. You do it because the position itself means something to you, or because you believe it will mean something for whatever comes after death, an idea that starts to shade directly into genuine belief about mortality itself, not just an emotional reaction to loss. By the time you reach anatomically modern humans in the Upper Paleolithic, roughly 30 to 40,000 years ago, the evidence becomes considerably richer and considerably harder to interpret as anything other than genuine mortality awareness. Burials from this period across Europe and Asia show elaborate grave goods, tools, jewelry, ochre pigment applied directly to bodies in patterns that required real time and effort. And in some remarkable cases at sites like Sungur in Russia, burials of children accompanied by thousands of individually crafted ivory beads, representing what researchers estimate would have taken literally thousands of hours of collective labor to produce. Think about what that actually implies. A community dedicating an enormous, genuinely staggering amount of collective time and skilled labor to prepare a body for a state that would never see, use, or benefit from any of it in any practical sense whatsoever. That's not behavior explained by simple emotional attachment or practical hygiene. That's behavior that only makes sense if the people doing it held a genuine, symbolic belief about what death was, what might follow it, and why the transition mattered enough to justify that level of investment. Here's where the actual, honest scientific debate lives, and it's worth being direct about the fact that this remains genuinely unresolved. Some researchers argue that elaborate burial practices like this are the clearest possible evidence of genuine mortality awareness, the recognition that death is permanent, universal, and something every individual will eventually face themselves, driving humans to develop symbolic responses, religious belief, ritual, and afterlife concept, specifically to process and manage that terrifying knowledge. This general framework has a name in psychology, terror management theory, developed by researchers including Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Piszczynski beginning in the late 1980s, arguing that a huge amount of human culture, religion, art, the desire to be remembered, to build lasting monuments, to have children who carry your name forward, functions at least partly as a psychological defense mechanism against the specific, uniquely human terror of knowing your own death is coming and being unable to prevent it. Under this view, elaborate ancient burial isn't just evidence that ancient humans understood mortality. It's evidence of exactly how much that understanding terrified them, and how much cultural machinery they built specifically to cope with it. Other researchers urge caution against reading too much specific belief into ancient burial evidence, pointing out that elaborate treatment of the dead could theoretically emerge from strong social bonds and grief alone, without necessarily requiring a fully abstract, philosophical understanding of universal mortality the way a modern adult human consciously holds it. It's a genuinely difficult epistemological problem, because the physical evidence, however elaborate, can never fully close the gap between what someone did and what someone understood while doing it. But here's a detail that pushes hard toward the terror management side of the debate, and it comes from an entirely different, more recent, and more direct source. Cave art. At sites like Chauvet Cave in France, dating back roughly 36,000 years, alongside the famous animal paintings, researchers have found handprints made by pressing a hand against the wall and blowing pigment around it, leaving a negative silhouette. Some researchers have proposed that these handprints, appearing across multiple sites and multiple tens of thousands of years, function partly as a way of saying, in the most literal physical sense available before writing existed, I was here. This hand belonged to someone. Remember this. If that interpretation holds any water, and it remains a matter of genuine scholarly debate, it suggests something remarkable, a species already grappling, tens of thousands of years before any written language, with the specific fear of being forgotten, of disappearing entirely and leaving no trace, which is very close to the exact same anxiety terror management theory argues still drives an enormous amount of modern human behavior today. So here's the honest answer to the question we open with, and it's more nuanced than a simple yes or no. The archaeological evidence strongly suggests that a genuine, symbolic understanding of death, its permanence, its universality, its eventual application to yourself personally, emerged gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, moving from simple practical disposal to deliberate but ambiguous burial, to increasingly elaborate ritual treatment that becomes very difficult to explain as anything other than a species actively wrestling with the specific knowledge that it, and every individual within it, was going to die. By the time you reach elaborately decorated Upper Paleolithic burials and handprints on cave walls, the evidence points toward humans who didn't just experience death happening around them. They understood it, feared it, and built entire systems of belief, ritual, and memory specifically to carry that knowledge without being crushed by it. There's something worth sitting with here, the idea that the specific dread you might feel thinking about your own mortality right now, reading this sentence, is not some uniquely modern anxiety invented by an overly self-aware species with too much free time to think about it. It's an ancient, deeply inherited weight, one your ancestors were already carrying, already building rituals and burying flowers and pressing their hands into cave walls to cope with, tens of thousands of years before anyone had a word for any of it. You didn't invent the fear of disappearing. You inherited it from people who were already trying, with everything they had, to make sure they wouldn't.